Hello and welcome to the third episode of Leading While Grieving, moving from grief to relief. Today we're going to talk about when the last casserole has been eaten. My name is Allison Nail-Malone. My company's name is Miss Syria, and our goal is to ensure that there's safe and sacred places for individuals to understand their grief, to define their grief, and take steps forward to navigate life in this new reality with this grief. And so welcome to Leading While Grieving. This is a free masterclass series and podcast. Last month, we talked about how to grieve and move forward, not move on. We talked a little bit more about what grief is and what loss feels like and how you would define that. We talked about the reality of grief and what people don't know about grief and what we wish people would know, as well as 5 practical strategies to move forward. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about what happens when the last casserole gets eaten. And as I've mentioned, my name is Allison Nail-Malone. I am a death doula, grief educator, and coach, as well as an end-of-life services doula. I also have another organization that focuses on executive and leadership coaching, as well as HR consulting called Malone Consultants Group. And so, like many people in the world, I experienced 2 significant losses at the beginning of 2020. I'll share a little bit more about that and kind of the inspiration of doing this work. But before I kind of dive into that, I want to share with you also a little bit about me personally. I am a avid outdoors person. I love to go hiking and being outside. It's the space for me to process emotions, and has been a very healthy place for me to release and learn to navigate with my own grief. I had on my walls when I was a teenager, not posters of athletes or singers or actors or bands. I had Nat Geo or National Geographic photos of animals and places I wanted to visit. And so this is Glacier National Park, which has kind of been what you would call at that point a vision board. And I'm at Lake McDonald, and it's kind of hard to see in this picture here, but all the rocks are multicolored. Looking over the Canadian Rockies. And soon after the death of my dad, I was able to make this dream and hope a reality. The other thing I want to share with you is I am a Bigfoot and Sasquatch enthusiast. I'm not saying that I necessarily believe in that, but I do think that the Sasquatch community and the grief community are pretty similar in some respects. Well, I got to choose to be in the Sasquatch community. There is a couple of things with that. Number one is the group in the Sasquatch community is very diverse. It has all ethnicities and races and mindsets and genders and cultures. And there is no one type of person, even though most society thinks that there's just this one kind of personality or person avatar that fits within the Sasquatch community, and it's just not true. The same is true as in the grief community. While I didn't get to choose to be in that community also is very diverse. And in fact, it's something that touches everyone at some point in their life, is the feeling of grief and loss. The other thing is that there is that specific bias. I mentioned that a lot of people think that, someone who believes in Sasquatch or Bigfoot, they fit this personality mode. They should act this way, or they do act this way, or this is the way they think. And so people think they've got them figured out. And the same is true in the grief community. Society thinks that grievers, or people who are grieving, should act a certain way, should look a certain way, it should be defined in the way that they think grief should be looking. And so I love that I actually get to be a part of both of those communities, one that I got to choose and one that I didn't get to choose, but I do get to choose to stay in because it's a community that understands my language. And so today we're going to talk about several different things. It seems like at the beginning of our grief, our friends are right there with us, our friends and our family, and even people kind of come out of the woodwork than we expected when we have a funeral or there is a death. And, they bring foods and casseroles, and there's always kind of that joke that after the funeral, people bring you, or after they hear about the death, they bring you the loads of casseroles, and you're eating casseroles for weeks. But then we reach a point where it feels like while the casseroles have now all disappeared, so have some of our people, and we don't know why. And then the last casserole gets eaten, and it feels like none of our people are around, or majority of our people are around. And so in today's masterclass, we're going to learn the 4 reasons why people seem to disappear, 4 ways that you can feel better now, and why cutting your friends just a little bit of slack can actually be a real gift for you. So before we get started, I just want to invite us to take a moment to honor and acknowledge your grief, as well as send love to the person we are missing today. So if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes with your hand on your heart or whatever feels good for you. Just to take this moment to acknowledge you showing up for yourself right now. And also just sending out love and honor to the person or persons or loved ones that we're missing today. And so one of the things that our society has a really tough time doing is defining grief outside of intellectualizing the Webster's dictionary version of it. Because there's so many components to grief, so many different phases, so many different ways that it can show up. It's really hard to define grief, but I'm curious if you're watching this, you see in front of you 9 different pictures. And so how would you describe your grief, or how would you describe grief, or how would you describe your grief in your own words based on these pictures? So there's 9 different pictures, in the chat. If you're here with me live, if you're journaling or taking notes while you're watching or listening to this, there's those 9 different pictures that you can choose from that either could define how you would describe grief or how you would describe your grief. One of the pictures for me is picture number 8, where it's kind of a rusty old saw blade. And grief at times can feel so raw and rusty and hard and uncomfortable. And then I've seen people take those rusty saw blades and paint pictures on them, and give a new beauty and meaning to the saw blade. And so that's kind of how I define it. And so in the chat, you can put down what number it is and maybe why you think that number represents either how you describe grief or how you describe your own grief. And while you're doing that, one of the things I want to share with you is what I have discovered to be true about grief. Grief is a response to love. Taking your grieving journey is an investment of time, not a loss of your time. Grief is evidence of your love and respect. And grief also transforms our mental, physical, behavioral, spiritual, or personal practices and beliefs. So David Kessler has this really short but meaningful quote that says, every loss has meaning, and every loss and all losses are to be grieved and witnessed. Every human being wants to be acknowledged, and every human wants to have an honoring of their experiences. And taking your grief on a journey is just that. It's witnessing your grief and it's honoring your experience. But grief is not something that many of us are comfortable talking about. And perhaps talking about grief makes us think about our own mortality, and most don't want to think about that, at least not until we reach a certain age. And even then, it's maybe. Also, often people don't know what to say to those who are grieving, yet grief is something that each of us experience and will continue to experience throughout our lives. We've been taught and have been expected to live our grief in stages. But the reality of grief is that there is no timeline and there are no linear stages of grief. It's really messy too. The reality of grief is one day I'll be just fine, and 2 months from now, there'll be a day that'll hit me right in the gut and take me out. And sometimes I will experience my grief, but I can still function. I can still be in a good mood. It's never the same each time grief gets brought back up. And I've talked about in previous episodes how grief is transformative. It transforms our perception, our thinking, and that grief is the evidence of our love. But grief also transforms things in our physical world. I have found that grief transforms our relationships too, the relationships with our loved ones, our colleagues, our communities. A great example is when a family loses a child, and everyone feels that loss very deeply for a period of time, and then they're gone. And then that community seems to not know what to do after a couple of days of grieving. And so grief changes, and a lot of parents of children talk about how incredibly lonely it is, and everyone has seemed to have disappeared. And even with the family with itself, there is a transformation within the relationship inside of that. And grief changes our friendships. People you thought would hang beside you through anything, either turn dismissive, they're unable to kind of hold space or gaze in your pain. People you thought would have capacity, people you thought would have it, but that just don't have the capacity for stillness turns out to be. And then sometimes people you thought would have no capacity for stillness turns out to be consistent witness for you. You never know who will come through and who will fade away. The only thing you know for sure is that grief will rearrange your address book and relationships change. So if you're here with me live, type a 1 in the chat if that's relatable to you. So where are all the people? Why are the people I thought would always be there unable to stand by me? We've been together in community. We've been friends. We're family. Like, where did everybody go? Well, grief's reality is based on our experience and also is evidence of our love. As a society, again, I mentioned that we just don't do death and dying very well, and we don't talk about our grief or mourn well either. And so when people seem to disseminate like that last casserole, it becomes a secondary loss that compounds your first loss. So there's several ways why, or there's several reasons why it feels like people start to disappear after the first few weeks of your loved one's death. And I think the most important reason why is vulnerability. Your loss, whether that is child, spouse, parent, friend, animal companion, it makes other people feel defenseless and helpless. It challenges their self-control and makes them face their own greatest fears of losing a loved one. For them to stand in your pain, they must touch a place in themselves that they just don't want to go. You were most likely the same prior to your loss. I know I was, and I'm sure I didn't show up the best way possible for my friends who needed me. Because back then, like your friends now, I had a choice. But now, like you, I don't get to choose the amount of vulnerability I expose myself to when we're talking about the death of a loved one, because the death of a loved one mandates that we step into vulnerability. There lies the difference between you and them. They can choose to walk away from feeling vulnerable or uncomfortable feelings and protect themselves and take shelter from the raw, vulnerable burn of an unexpected death. They get to slather up with the VPF 50 or the vulnerable protection factor, and they get to go on with their lives, appropriately protected from the damaging effects of feeling too deeply or feelings of the vulnerability of loss. You don't and you didn't get to choose to be a part of this club, and you no longer get to slather yourself up in the VPF 50 and pretend that the universal laws of life and death don't apply to you. So you my loved one are raw and opened up to life's most scary realities. And it burns hotter than we can reach and it burns hotter when we reach out for support and we don't get what we need. So besides that vulnerability, here are 4 reasons why people leave us, quote, leave us when we are grieving. Number 1, I'm sure this will come as no surprise that as a society, we're pretty grief illiterate. Most people have never been through something like this and they have no idea what it's like. So they're not prepared. I literally cringe when I think about how I handled loss in other people's lives before my dad died, because I was the person that disappeared. I was the one who acted weird, and it wasn't because I didn't mean well. It was because I just never really been through something like this, and I just didn't have any idea of what it was like. I was empathetic and wanted to be there for them. I just didn't know how. And most of what people know about grief isn't even accurate, right? We get all hung up on the 5, quote, stages, which is only one of many theories. And even Elizabeth Kubler-Ross admitted, who came up with the 5 stages of grief, that she did not mean for that to be taken literally in linear timeline. We don't talk about grief. We don't talk about death. It is still taboo for a lot of us to even explore. So when someone's going through it and we've never been through it, and we live in a culture that's kind of uncomfortable with it, then we don't really know how to behave. A second reason why people seem to disappear is that their life goes on and your loss isn't front and center for them like it is for you. Their life really has gone back to normal. And our life, it hasn't gone back to normal, right? Ours still feels like it exploded or the rug got ripped out from underneath us. We're very aware of our loss on a daily, hourly, minute by minute basis, but other people aren't. And this is not an insult, but sometimes humans have the attention span of a goldfish. And so when we're out of sight, we're also out of mind. And because they are not in our shoes, in our house, in our heart, they aren't thinking about what's going on for us as much as what we're thinking about it for ourselves. It's not, in most cases, it's not because they don't love us. They just have their own challenges, right? And they have their own things happening in their own world. It's easy to forget about what's not directly in front of them. The third reason why people seem to disappear and leave us while we're grieving, oftentimes your people just love you so much and they're worried they're going to upset you. They don't understand that you're thinking about it all of the time, or at least very regularly. They don't truly understand that the chances are very high that you would actually like them to talk about it with you and like to talk about your person or your loved one. You like it, maybe you would like it if they told stories and brought it because you're thinking about it. And it's nice to know that you're not the only person thinking of your loved one. And because they don't know that, then they're worried that they're going to upset you, so they don't want to bring it up. That's the logic in their minds sometimes as well, that if I bring it up, it will just make them sad again, and I don't want them to be sad again. So I'll just not bring it up. I'll just be quiet about it. And majority of the people that I've talked to, that I've coached, that I've done grief coaching with, or done education sessions like this, or just spoken with people one-on-one, there's very few people that don't want to talk about their loved one. Majority of the people say, I just wish someone would say their name. Reason number 4, for some people, what you're going through is actually their worst fear. Most people don't want to think about their own mortality. They don't want to think about their partner dying. They don't want to imagine a life, what it would be like without their person or beloved pet or beloved animal companion. They just don't want to put themselves in your shoes because it doesn't sound like any fun. It is terrible. And they may not be doing it consciously, but unconsciously, it's so uncomfortable for them to imagine that they just avoid it. And it's not because they don't love us. It's just that they don't have the capacity to be with us, to be that part of the human experience. They don't know how to feel good when we feel bad. If you've ever been around or maybe look around in your friend group, people who are probably the most supportive and the people who aren't saying the cliches and platitudes are probably the ones that have been through some sort of similar experience. They know that this sucks, and they know that that it happened, and they don't try to make you feel better. They are just there with you when you feel bad. And we can't blame the people who don't have that skill. They just didn't learn it. We don't learn it. No one taught them. So I'm curious for you. I'm going to do a quick check-in with you. Take a deep breath in and out. Which of these 4 reasons why people seem to disappear most resonated with you? Was it number 1, that we're a society that's pretty grief illiterate? Is it 2, it's the realization that it's not in the forefront for them and their life continues to move on while mine kind of stays here? 3 is that they're worried that they're going to upset you, or 4, that it's truly their worst fear, or 5, the bonus is vulnerability. Let's talk about the 4 ways to feel better right now. So I'm going to just invite you to take another deep breath in and release. Do this one more time. And maybe just check in with your body to see how you're feeling. Taking another deep breath in and out. First, I want to say that these 4 ways to feel better right now are not a cure to your grief, because there simply is no cure to your grief. These are just 4 strategies I'm going to share with you, are very simple ways to incorporate so that you can start to feel a little bit better with your grief. Number 1 is to acknowledge your grief and give it space. I often teach that grief is like a little baby. It requires attention and to be nourished. Your grief is important and it wants to be acknowledged. This allows our grief the space to breathe and to heal. One way you could do this is to schedule 15 minutes in your schedule that is totally dedicated to expressing your grief. You can do this daily or weekly, or if you are further along in your grief, maybe it's just once a month. As an end-of-life doula and grief coach who works with many people who are grieving, one idea that I have learned that works for some people is just to set aside time every day, say 15 minutes, be by yourself in a quiet place. Decide to concentrate on thinking of the person who has died, and just let yourself cry, or give yourself permission to just grieve. However that shows up. This doesn't mean that all of your grieving takes place during the short periods of time you schedule. However, it does help to create a time and a sacred place to be alone with your grief. Number 2 is to acknowledge your loved one and to give them space. This is a picture of my sister and I with my dad in the middle. My dad passed away in 2020, and it was really the inspiration for me doing this work. Now, this might sound a little bit off, but hear me out. Many of us have different beliefs about what happens to us after we die. However, what we do know is that even though our loved one is no longer with us physically, they are still with us in our mind and heart. We still have our memories of them. We may still have memories, smells, pictures, videos, etc. of them. So you do still have a relationship with them. They are still with you, just in a different form. This takes time to cultivate. And when we can give the same kind of space to our relationship with our loved one, as I mentioned, with the giving space of our grief, our brain and our heart begins to heal with just a little more ease and softness. Number 3 is to do one thing that you keep as a ritual, even though you don't feel like it. When death happens, one of the very first things to take a back seat is our routine. So much energy is taken up when our loved one dies, when we grieve, and when we try to navigate back to, quote, real life. This routine doesn't necessarily need to be daily, although it can be really helpful at the very beginning. And you may need to ask someone to lean in to help support you. For example, perhaps walking 10 minutes, perhaps including 10 minutes of walking with your kiddo or friend daily or every other daily. I actually started doing creative journaling at least once a week, but I started out when I first started doing this as a way to process 3 times a week. And here's a picture of one of my pieces of artwork, one of my creative journaling where I was really feeling very heavily the grief of my dad. Number 4 is to let go and give grace. One reason we lose friends after a loved one dies is that we expect them to know what we need using our life experiences as the reference point. The perfect example of us using our own life to scale others' experience is the comment quote, "I know how you feel. I lost my dog, cat, goldfish, great aunt, teddy bear." Fill in the blank with something you perceive to be less than your loss here. The person is trying to connect with you based on his or her or their own experience. And that's just the best that they can do, whether you like it or not. Just as you wouldn't go to your dentist to deliver a baby, be realistic about what your friend's strengths are and how they can support you. Perhaps you have a dear friend who sucks at hearing your stories of sadness, but she's great at bringing home baked cookies unannounced. She is showing up in the best way that she can. Honor that in her and don't make her be the bad guy when she can't do what she doesn't know or can't do. So how do you get your friends to get it? You don't. Your job is to continue to do the hard work of healing and healing fully and reap the benefits of doing this hard work. Your job is not to make your grieving journey about how other people respond to you. If you want to make it about how other people are reacting, are responding to you, I'm sorry. If you want to make it about how other people are reacting, then do that by your own actions. Your authenticity and truth about what heals you and owning your journey will make people take notice in a cultural paradigm shifting way. We're nearing the end of our time together today. And so one thing I'd love to make sure that you do take away from is yours is a sacred journey. It's not a Disneyland vacation. So choose your community wisely. You could go to Disneyland with just about everyone and everything would be ponies and rainbow. Everything would be Mickey Mouse and rainbows. The sacred journey of deep healing decrees that we carefully select our community. For these types of journeys, it is better to have a small group of fierce healing warriors in the arena with you than 1,000 fans cheering you on from the stand. The truth is that we do need both, though. I'm not suggesting that you unfriend people who aren't able to stand in the fire with you. Rather, cast the characters in your life story in the roles that they best can play. We need all types of people in our world. And most importantly, seek to surround yourself with those who can stand in the fire with you. Join a support group, an online community, attend a retreat, or whatever you need to do to cast the other roles that your current friends and family can't fill. And remember that your grieving journey, it just means that it takes time to adjust to your new normal. So let's just do a quick check-in. Here are the 4 strategies to feel better now. Which one of these most resonated with you? And you can type a 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat, or write this in your journal, or as you're listening, just consider which one of these most resonated with you. Number 1 is to acknowledge and give your grief. Acknowledge your grief and give it space. Number 2 is to acknowledge your loved one and give them space too. Number 3 is to do the one thing that you can keep as a ritual, even when you don't feel like it. Number 4 is to do one thing that you keep as, number 4 is to choose your community wisely. I'm just going to end with this quote. Healing grief does not mean that you'll forget. There will always be a hole in your heart. It will still hurt, but in time, it will hurt less often. Allow the power of grief to further your healing and remember that your love is forever. So I just want you to know that you're not alone. There's a ton of free and low-cost resources out there in the world. One is a monthly subscription called Tender Hearts through grief.com. It is led by David Kessler himself. And there's a ton of wonderful resources and communities in there. There's tons of support groups. If you're not sure where to start to find a support group, reach out to your local hospice center. A lot of hospice centers do not require you to have had a loved one in their services, but would still welcome you into their grief, their group supports, grief group supports, whatever. Also, I'm a reader. I process my emotions through education and reading. And so one of my favorite books is It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine. If you're a podcast, another great podcast to listen to is Grief Out Loud. Also wanted to share with you, as a grief educator and coach and an end-of-life doula and end-of-life planner, I do have one-on-one sessions that I take people through their grieving journey. I'll also be starting at the end of March, my first Leading While Grieving group program. And it's a 2.5-month program where we will move from grief to relief through defining your grief journey, discovering ways to navigate through that grief while still living life in really powerful and empowered ways, as well as creating a collective community that speaks the same language as you and to create support around you. If this is something that you're interested in, you can see here on my website at mymiseria, mymiseria.com/grieving dash leaders. So it's mymiseria.com/grieving dash leaders. And so I'm just going to invite you to take a moment here, if you're live here with me, or if you're journaling to this, or if you're just listening to this, is to pause for just a moment and ask yourself what was most meaningful for you. What is the one thing, if you took away nothing else, this would be the most meaningful for you? And so I want to thank you so much for being a part of our conversation today and holding presence alongside your grief and your loved one. My next section at episode 4 will be Saturday, March 18th, which is the same time as we have it today, and that's 11 a.m. Central. Thank you so much for joining me here today, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.